In the shadowed heart of South Carolina's Lowcountry, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral veils from ancient oaks, one bed in a grand plantation house remained untouched for 40 years. Never slept in. Never disturbed. Never spoken of aloud. It was not locked. It was simply forbidden. And in that silence, a sin waited patient as divine judgment until the day heaven itself decided the debt must be paid. The year was 1789 when the Harrington Plantation first rose from the red clay of Beaufort County like a white-columned monument to ambition and empire. 3 stories of federal-style grandeur, its portico catching the dying light each afternoon so that the columns gleamed like the teeth of something smiling too wide. 800 acres of prime cotton land stretched out behind it, row after perfect row, tended by hands that belonged to no one. The air always carried the smell of damp earth, magnolia blossoms heavy with sweetness, and the distant crack of the overseer's whip riding the wind like a prayer no one dared finish. Thomas Harrington inherited it all in 1801 at 23, young, steady, the kind of man Lowcountry society called respectable. He had served in the militia, paid his debts on time, and carried himself with the quiet certainty of someone who believed order was a virtue bestowed by God himself. His father's will had been clear: the land, the house, the 120 souls bound to it. Thomas accepted the inheritance the way other men accepted communion, solemnly, without question. He married Eleanor Carpenters in 1802. Not for love, but for land and lineage. Her family's plantation lay 30 miles north. Their union was a ledger entry, 2 fortunes folded into one. By 1810 they had 3 children: William, the heir apparent, born 1803, Catherine, delicate and watchful, 1805, and James, the quiet one, 1808. On the surface the Harringtons were everything a planter family should be: stable, fertile, embedded in the social fabric like roots in good soil. But roots, as any Lowcountry preacher will tell you, can hide rot. The eastern wing had been added in 1795, 6 bedrooms along a long sunlit corridor that overlooked the formal gardens. 5 rooms lived and breathed with the rhythms of the family, children's laughter, Eleanor's evening prayers, Thomas's heavy boots after a day in the fields. The 6th room, at the very end of that hallway, did not. No one could later say exactly when the prohibition began. The servants who dusted the wing always when the family was away, always in pairs so no single witness could be accused, spoke of it only in the slave quarters after dark, voices lowered until they were almost swallowed by the night. The room had been prepared for someone. A 4-poster bed with crisp linens, a wardrobe stocked with modest but fine clothing, a writing desk, a small fireplace whose ashes were swept clean every month. Everything in a state of frozen readiness. Yet it had never been occupied. Not once in 40 years. The bed was never slept in. The wardrobe doors stayed closed over garments that smelled only of cedar, never of human skin. The desk held no ink stains, no crumpled letters, no evidence that a living soul had ever sat there wrestling with conscience or desire. It was as if the room itself had been cursed into perpetual anticipation, waiting for a guest who the Harringtons had already decided would never be allowed to arrive. Visitors were never taken down that corridor. If guests needed lodging, they were steered to the main house or the guest cottage near the gate. Servants cleaning the wing received the same terse instructions year after year: do your work. Speak of nothing. Leave no trace. Eleanor Harrington delivered those orders herself, her voice soft but edged like the blade of a letter opener. She was the keeper of the silence, the high priestess of the unspoken. Thomas never entered the room. William, Catherine, and James grew up knowing better than to ask. The eastern wing became a held breath in the body of the house, present, but never acknowledged. Like guilt that has learned to wear the face of normalcy. The servants felt it differently. Some of the older ones, those who had come with the original grant, whispered that the room carried the weight of something Thomas had done before his marriage. A woman in Charleston. Mixed blood. A child. Arrangements had been made, money sent north to Virginia relatives, but the child had not been erased. She had simply been postponed. Then, in the spring of 1811, the letter arrived. It came from a small town in Virginia few South Carolinians had ever heard of. The handwriting was careful, almost painfully precise, the script of someone who had practiced every line so the truth would not tremble. Thomas read it alone in his study. When he emerged, his face was the color of wet ash. He summoned Eleanor. The door closed. Raised voices leaked through the thick wood, words the servants could not quite catch, but the tone was unmistakable: accusation, defense, the brittle sound of a marriage cracking along an old fault line. An hour later Eleanor stepped out, composure restored like a mask snapped back into place. But her eyes had changed. Something ancient had woken behind them. Within weeks a carriage rolled up the long oak-lined drive carrying a young woman of perhaps 20. Dark hair pinned neatly, features that echoed Thomas Harrington so clearly it was almost blasphemous. Her name was Margaret. And she was his daughter, born of the Charleston woman who had died when Margaret was an infant. The relatives in Virginia could no longer keep her. Thomas had obligations, even a man as careful as he could not fully deny blood. But acknowledgement was impossible. In the society that had built the Harrington fortune, a daughter of mixed heritage was not a daughter at all. She was evidence. She was scandal. She was the living proof that Thomas's public piety and private appetites had collided. Eleanor's position as legitimate wife and mother of legitimate heirs could not be compromised. The solution was elegant in its cruelty. The Eastern Wing Room. Margaret was installed there like a secret sacrament no one dared receive. She ate alone. She never entered the public rooms. She never attended church, never walked the gardens in daylight, never rode into town. To the outside world she did not exist. To the servants she was a distant relative in delicate health who requires solitude. Any deviation from that story meant the lash or sail down river. Some servants understood the truth the moment they saw her face. Others invented kinder lies to protect their own hearts. Margaret herself accepted the terms with a resignation that chilled the blood. She had grown up in poverty and shadow. The plantation, for all its bars of silence, offered books, regular meals, and a roof that did not leak. She read voraciously by candlelight, wrote letters she would never send, and watched her half-siblings grow from the narrow window that faced the fields. She was 21 when the War of 1812 began and ended. 25 when the cotton gin turned the South into an empire of white gold. 30 when Thomas's wealth doubled and his social standing hardened into legend. All the while she remained exactly where she had been placed, present, yet erased. The family expanded. Eleanor bore 2 more children, Susan in 1812, Robert in 1815. They grew up in a house that simply pretended the Eastern Wing did not exist. Servants learned to glide past that corridor as if it were a wall of air. Margaret watched from her window as William became a young gentleman, as Catherine bloomed into a marriageable beauty draped in silks and attended by maids who would never be allowed to attend her. She watched James ride out at dawn with the easy confidence of someone who belonged to the sunlit world. She watched Susan and Robert toddle across the lawns, their laughter rising like hymns she was forbidden to join. The room became her entire universe. Not locked from the outside, there was no bolt on the door. She could have walked out at any moment. But to walk out was to invite questions that would destroy the only fragile security she had ever known. So she stayed. A ghost who cast a shadow only the servants could see. Thomas almost succeeded in forgetting her. He never visited the room. He never asked after her health. He treated her non-existence as a form of moral hygiene. Eleanor, however, took a colder satisfaction in the arrangement. She chose Margaret's meals. She approved the books. She decided how much light, how much heat, how much human contact the girl would be granted. When a servant's tongue slipped or a visitor strayed too close to the wing, Eleanor moved with the swiftness of divine retribution, quiet, absolute, final. By 1825 the secret had held for 14 years. The plantation prospered. The family's reputation remained stainless. The bed in the Eastern Wing remained untouched. Then a traveling physician named Dr. Nathaniel Prescott arrived. He had been summoned to treat Eleanor's fever. A learned man from Philadelphia, he carried the sharp, restless curiosity of someone who had studied medicine but also the hidden anatomy of Southern households. For 3 days he moved through the great house, noting the careful choreography of avoidance, the way certain corridors emptied when he approached, the way servants' eyes flicked toward the Eastern Wing and then away as if burned. On his final evening, as he prepared to depart at first light, Dr. Prescott sat with Thomas in the study. The fire crackled low. Outside, the night pressed against the windows like an uninvited witness. "Tell me, Mr. Harrington," the doctor began, his voice mild but precise. "I could not help noticing the eastern wing of the house. It appears unoccupied. Structural concerns, perhaps? Or some other reason the rooms stand empty?" Thomas's reply came too quickly, too forcefully. "The eastern wing is perfectly sound, doctor. The family simply has no present need for those bedrooms. They are kept in readiness should the occasion arise." He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. But the doctor had already seen the tremor in the man's hands. And somewhere down the long hallway, in the room where one bed had waited untouched for 40 years, Margaret Harrington, unseen, unacknowledged, yet undeniably alive, closed her book and listened to the silence that had just begun, ever so slightly, to crack. The fire in Thomas Harrington's study had burned low that evening in 1825, casting long, wavering shadows across the mahogany paneling like fingers reaching for secrets. Dr. Nathaniel Prescott sat across from his host, the scent of pipe smoke and aged brandy hanging thick in the air. Outside, the Lowcountry night pressed against the tall windows, cicadas screaming their relentless hymn, Spanish moss swaying like funeral crepe in the breeze. The doctor, trained in the rigorous halls of Philadelphia, had spent 3 days observing the rhythms of the great house. He had noted the precise geometry of avoidance, how servants' footsteps quickened past the entrance to the eastern wing, how Eleanor's smile tightened whenever a casual glance drifted in that direction, how the very air seemed heavier there, as though the corridor itself held its breath. With careful politeness, Dr. Prescott leaned forward. "I could not help noticing, Mr. Harrington, that the eastern wing appears unused. Perfectly maintained, of course, but unoccupied. Is there some structural concern? Dampness in the walls, perhaps? Or simply no need for the space at present?" Thomas's answer came too fast, too smooth, the words polished like river stones. "Nothing unusual at all, doctor. Many great houses keep rooms in readiness for future guests or family. The wing is sound. We simply have no need of it now." But the doctor was not a man easily deflected. He had walked the corridors in the small hours when sleep evaded him. The old house groaned inside like any aging structure, yet he had heard something else: soft footsteps, the faint rustle of fabric, the almost imperceptible creak of a floorboard under careful weight. "Forgive me," Prescott continued, his voice gentle but unrelenting, "but last night, while I walked to ease my restlessness, I thought I heard movement in that wing. A voice, perhaps? Or someone shifting in a room. Old houses do settle, but this sounded inhabited." Thomas Harrington's face went utterly still. The mask of Southern hospitality cracked for the briefest instant, revealing something colder beneath fear, yes, but also the iron resolve of a man protecting the architecture of his lies. "You must have been mistaken, doctor," he said quietly, each word measured. "The wind plays strange tricks through these corridors at night. The house is old. It speaks in many tongues. There is no one in the eastern wing. No one at all." The denial hung in the room like incense after a forbidden rite. That very night, after the doctor had retired, Eleanor Harrington summoned the 2 servants responsible for Margaret's care. They stood before her in the dim lamplight of the parlor, heads bowed, hands trembling slightly. Eleanor's voice was ice-wrapped in velvet, cold, precise, without a single wasted syllable. "From this moment forward, the woman in the eastern wing is to make no sound whatsoever. Not a cough. Not a footstep louder than a whisper. If Dr. Prescott hears anything at all, before he leaves at first light, the consequences will fall not only on her, but on every soul in this house. Do you understand me?" The servants nodded, throats tight. They understood. Eleanor's threats were never idle. They carried the weight of sale, of separation from family, of the lash if necessary. The secret was worth any price. Dr. Prescott departed the next morning without further incident. Yet the episode had torn something open in the household. For the first time in 14 years, the invisible boundary around Margaret had been tested. The family's swift, merciless response revealed the depth of their investment in silence. The servants moved through the halls with new caution, eyes downcast, as though the very walls might betray them. And Margaret? She remained exactly where she had been placed, 30 years old now, her dark hair threaded with the first silver of endurance, her eyes carrying the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned that survival often meant becoming smaller than the space allotted to you. The 1820s folded into the 1830s. Cotton was king, and the Harrington plantation swelled like a living thing. Nearly 2,000 acres now, worked by more than 300 enslaved souls whose labor turned white fields into rivers of wealth. Thomas's fortune multiplied. The family's standing in Beaufort County hardened into local aristocracy. William, the eldest son, married Caroline, a neighboring planter's daughter, and began filling the nursery with his own heirs. Catherine wed a Charleston merchant and moved away. James took to the militia with fiery convictions about the natural order of society. Susan and Robert grew into adulthood, still tethered to the plantation's rhythms. Yet the eastern wing remained untouched by change. New servants arrived as old ones died or were sold. They were given the same catechism: the eastern wing is not discussed. Visitors are never shown that corridor. Speak of what you see or hear there and suffer the consequences. Some never even learned Margaret's name. To them, the forbidden hallway was simply another law of the land, like the prohibition on teaching enslaved children to read, or the stark contrast between the family's Sunday worship and the spiritual starvation imposed on those who toiled in the fields. Margaret watched it all from her single window. She saw her half-brother William ride out each morning with the confident posture of a man who owned the horizon. She saw Caroline, her sister-in-law, move through the house with the easy grace of legitimate belonging. She saw nieces and nephews born into light and freedom while she remained a shadow that cast no official reflection. The room itself had become more than a prison. It was a living tomb of slow erasure. The bed, still never slept in by anyone but her in all these years, bore the faint impression of her body now, though the linens were changed with ritual precision. The wardrobe held the few modest dresses Eleanor permitted. The writing desk was covered in unsent letters, pages filled with thoughts too dangerous to share with the world. Books piled high, histories, poetry, scripture, her only companions in the long silences between meals. She was not locked in. The door had no external bolt. Freedom was always one step away, and infinitely far. To leave would be to destroy the fragile ecosystem of lies that sustained her. So she stayed, year after year, a living contradiction to the family's carefully constructed fiction of purity. Thomas aged. His hair silvered, his step slowed, yet he never once visited the eastern wing. He had perfected the art of not seeing. Eleanor, by contrast, maintained her vigil with grim devotion. She chose Margaret's meals, approved her reading material, decided when the single small fire could be lit in winter. She was the architect of the isolation, finding in it a strange, bitter satisfaction, a way to punish Thomas's past sin while preserving the family's sacred image. In 1835, the silence faced its second serious threat. Harriet, a distant cousin of Eleanor's, arrived as a grieving widow seeking distraction among kin. She was a woman of sharp intellect and restless curiosity, well-read, well-traveled, the kind of guest who noticed everything. During her stay she observed the same patterns Dr. Prescott had noted a decade earlier: the avoided corridor, the servants' nervous choreography, the way Eleanor's jaw tightened at any casual mention of the eastern wing. Unlike the doctor, Harriet felt entitled to answers. One warm afternoon while Eleanor rested, she cornered Thomas in the library. "I've noticed the eastern wing seems entirely unused," she said lightly, yet with steel beneath. "Such beautiful space going to waste. Have you considered turning it into proper guest quarters? It seems a shame to leave it empty." Thomas repeated the familiar lie, voice steady as a sermon. "The rooms are kept ready should we ever need them. Nothing unusual." Harriet was not satisfied. Family, after all, had privileges. "Might I see them? I've always been fascinated by the architecture, how the wing was joined to the main house. The proportions intrigue me." Thomas refused. The rooms were dusty, he claimed. Used for storage. Not fit for a lady's eyes. The excuse was transparently false. Harriet studied him for a long moment, her gaze unflinching. "There is someone in those rooms, isn't there?" she said quietly. "Someone you do not wish the world to know about." Thomas's face drained of color. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. "That," he finally whispered, "is not a question you should ask, Harriet. And it is not one I am prepared to answer." Harriet understood she had touched something radioactive. She did not press further that day, but she watched. She noted the servants who slipped quietly toward the wing with trays. She saw Eleanor's posture change whenever the topic hovered near. She felt the peculiar, weighted silence that clung to that part of the house like a shroud. On her final evening, Harriet requested a private word with Eleanor in the parlor. Lamplight flickered across their faces as Harriet spoke plainly. "I know there is someone living in the eastern wing. I do not know who, or why, but I have seen the signs. I understand what they mean." Eleanor's response was glacial. "What you believe you understand, Harriet, is that some matters are not fit for discussion. I trust you will respect this family's privacy. Should you speak of your suspicions to anyone, the consequences will be severe not only for you, but for your own reputation and the standing of your kin." Harriet left the plantation the next morning. She kept her silence, not out of fear of Eleanor's threats, but because she recognized the poison such a revelation would spread. Some secrets, once released, could never be recaptured. Yet she did write a letter to a trusted friend, a single sheet sealed and marked to be opened only after her death. In careful script she described the strange avoidance of the eastern wing, her conviction that a woman was being kept there in secret, and her suspicion that it concerned the family's honor. The letter was tucked away among her papers and, for the time being, forgotten. By the late 1830s, Margaret had entered her 40s. Nearly her entire adult life had unfolded within four walls. She had never known courtship, marriage, or the cry of her own child. She had never walked freely beneath the live oaks or felt the sun on her face without fear of discovery. Her existence had become a legal and moral knot the family could no longer easily ignore. Thomas was aging. His health faltered. The question of his will loomed like Judgment Day. Margaret's status was dangerously ambiguous. He had never formally acknowledged her as his daughter, that would have meant admitting the sin of her conception and the racial reality that would shatter the family's social throne. Yet he had brought her to the plantation and provided for her in his guarded way. She was not enslaved, but neither was she free. She could not leave without permission, could not own property, could not marry, could not sign contracts. She existed in a legal limbo the law had no name for, a living ghost in the machinery of Southern inheritance. Thomas and Eleanor discussed the problem in hushed tones behind closed doors. William, now deeply involved in management, was gradually drawn into the conspiracy of silence. What would happen to Margaret when Thomas died? If she were freed and acknowledged, the entire shameful history would spill into daylight. If she remained confined, the next generation would have to inherit not only the land and the wealth, but the burden of maintaining the lie and the cost of her continued care. The bed in the eastern wing had now waited untouched by any outsider for nearly 30 years. But time, like divine justice, has a way of refusing to be ignored forever. The silence that had protected the Harringtons was growing thinner, more brittle. And somewhere in the distance, the slow, inexorable footsteps of consequence were beginning to echo down the long corridor of history. The winter of 1840 settled over the Lowcountry like a shroud. Cold winds swept across the cotton fields, stripping the last brown leaves from the live oaks and carrying with them the heavy scent of damp earth and coming death. Thomas Harrington, 62 years old, had been fading for months. His once steady hands now trembled as they gripped the arms of his chair. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale a quiet battle. On a gray January morning, with Eleanor at his bedside and the family gathered in hushed prayer, Thomas drew his last breath. The plantation mourned him publicly as one of Beaufort County's most respected pillars. The church bells tolled. Neighbors arrived in black carriages. Eulogies spoke of his fairness, his industry, his devotion to the Southern way of life. No one mentioned the room at the end of the eastern corridor. No one dared. After the funeral, the family assembled in the grand parlor for the reading of the will. Samuel Whitfield, the Harrington family lawyer for over 30 years, cleared his throat and began. The document was long and meticulous, as the testaments of wealthy men usually are. The plantation, now nearly 2,000 acres of prime land, was divided primarily among the legitimate children. William received the bulk as eldest son and primary heir. Catherine, James, Susan, and Robert received substantial portions. Generous provisions were made for Eleanor's lifelong comfort. Bequests flowed to the local church, to charitable causes, and to various relatives. But Margaret's name appeared nowhere. The omission was deafening. Thomas had chosen silence even in death. No acknowledgement. No freedom granted. No financial provision. No instruction for her care. In that eloquent void, the message was unmistakable: the family was to continue exactly as before. Margaret was to remain a ghost in the eastern wing, unseen, unmentioned, unclaimed. The fiction of the Harrington family's purity was to be preserved at all costs. Yet one clause stood out as unusual, almost prophetic. It granted William, as executor of the estate, full authority over all matters related to the property and its management, including all matters of a private or confidential nature that may have been entrusted to my care during my lifetime. To outsiders, the language seemed routine. To those who knew the truth, Eleanor, William, and the handful of servants bound by fear, it was a sacred charge. William was now not only master of the land but guardian of the family's darkest secret. He accepted the responsibility without visible hesitation. His face remained composed, his posture straight. Inside, the weight settled upon him like another layer of the southern soil he had inherited. The 1840s and 1850s unfolded like a slow-burning fever across the nation. Cotton prices soared, then dipped, then soared again. The question of slavery moved from whispered debate to open rupture. Abolitionist voices in the North grew louder, sharper, accusing the South of moral rot. In the South, planters like the Harringtons doubled down, defending the institution as biblical, natural, even divinely ordained. William Harrington became increasingly vocal. He spoke at county meetings, wrote letters to newspapers, and rose in the local militia as tensions mounted toward what many feared would become armed conflict. Yet even as William thundered publicly about the God-given order of master and servant, he maintained the private prison in his own house without apparent contradiction. In his mind, Margaret was not enslaved, she was blood, however tainted. She was cared for. She had a roof, food, books. That she had spent her entire adult life confined to four walls, stripped of every freedom a human soul might claim, did not register to him as injustice. It was simply the necessary price of preserving the family's honor. Margaret herself had entered her 50s, then her 60s. Her dark hair had gone fully white. Deep lines etched her face, carved by decades of quiet endurance rather than laughter or sunlight. She no longer hoped for change. Escape had become an abstract idea, as distant as the stars she sometimes watched through her narrow window on clear nights. Her days passed in a rhythm of resigned stillness, reading by lamplight until her eyes ached, composing letters she would never post, long, eloquent reflections on scripture, on justice, on the nature of sin and forgiveness, then folding them carefully away in the desk drawer. Sometimes she sang softly to herself, old hymns learned in childhood, melodies laced with sorrow that seemed to rise from the very walls. The servants who tended her rotated constantly. New faces replaced old ones, but the instructions never changed: absolute silence. Deliver the tray. Clean when the family is absent. Speak of nothing. Some felt pity for the quiet old woman who thanked them with gentle dignity. Others felt only the numb acceptance that comes from living under constant threat. All understood that the secret of the eastern wing had become part of the plantation's very atmosphere, like the humidity, like the call of the whippoorwill at dusk, like the unspoken knowledge that some sins are too dangerous to name. In 1858, the next generation stepped forward. Thomas Harrington Jr., William's eldest son, had come of age. Tall, intelligent, ambitious, he had been educated at a prestigious Charleston academy and had traveled north to Philadelphia and New York. Exposure to wider ideas had sharpened his mind, though he remained loyal to the family's southern roots. He threw himself into the management of the plantation with energy and precision. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing the household ledgers in his grandfather's old study, something caught his eye. Regular, substantial expenses for the eastern wing: food, candles, firewood, linens, minor repairs had continued for decades. Yet as far as Thomas Jr. could determine, that entire section of the house stood empty and unused. He confronted his father that evening in the library, firelight dancing across the bookshelves. "Father, I've noticed ongoing costs for the eastern wing. Food, fuel, maintenance, for rooms that appear completely unoccupied. Can you explain?" William's response was smooth but evasive. "The rooms are kept in readiness. A great house must be maintained. The expense is negligible compared to our overall holdings. Do not trouble yourself with it." Thomas Jr. was not satisfied. Educated in a changing age, he pressed. "If the wing is maintained, I should see it. One day the entire plantation will be my responsibility. I need to understand every part of it." William refused outright. The rooms were not suitable for viewing at present. There were other, more pressing matters. Thomas Jr. should focus on the fields, the accounts, the coming political storms. The refusal only ignited greater curiosity. Over the following weeks, Thomas Jr. began asking careful, indirect questions of the servants. Most refused to speak. Some offered vague, contradictory answers. But fragments slowly assembled into a picture. There was someone living in the eastern wing. A woman. She had been there longer than most servants could remember. Her existence was never to be mentioned. He watched more closely. He noted the servants who slipped quietly down that corridor with trays. He saw how his father's jaw tightened at any casual reference to the wing. He felt the peculiar, weighted hush that clung to that part of the house like a curse. Then, one humid summer evening, as twilight bled across the gardens, Thomas Jr. walked the main corridor near the eastern wing. The house was quiet. Most of the family had retired. He heard it. A woman's voice, soft, elderly, trembling with age, singing an old spiritual in a haunting minor key. The melody spoke of exile, of longing, of a soul waiting for deliverance that never came. The words were indistinct, but the sorrow in them was unmistakable, ancient, biblical in its depth. It drifted through the closed door like incense from a hidden altar. Thomas Jr. froze in the hallway, heart pounding. He listened until the song faded into silence. In that moment, he knew beyond doubt, the eastern wing held a living secret. A prisoner of blood and memory. The next morning he confronted his father directly in the study, door closed, voices low but intense. "Who is in the eastern wing? And why have you kept her hidden all these years?" William's face flushed with anger. He slammed his hand on the desk. "There are matters that are not for you to question. The eastern wing is not your concern. Stop this immediately, or there will be consequences." But Thomas Jr. had been shaped by a different age. He would not be cowed. "I will not stop. A human being has been confined in our own house for decades. I demand the truth." After a long, tense silence, William finally broke. His voice was heavy, resigned. "Her name is Margaret. She is your half-aunt, my half-sister. Your grandfather's daughter by a woman of mixed race in Charleston. She was brought here decades ago because we could not acknowledge her without destroying everything this family has built. To recognize her would have meant admitting to a union that produced a child of tainted blood. It would have been social ruin." Thomas Jr. absorbed the revelation in stunned silence. When his father finished, he asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Is she free?" William hesitated. "She is not enslaved, if that is what you mean. But she is not free in any true sense. She cannot leave without permission. She cannot own anything. She cannot marry. She exists in a legal shadow with no name." "Then she is a prisoner," Thomas Jr. said quietly, voice edged with moral horror. "She is family," William snapped. "She is cared for. That is sufficient." But Thomas Jr. could not accept the cold arithmetic of silence. He insisted on meeting Margaret, on speaking with her, on understanding the truth with his own eyes. William refused. Such a meeting would only disturb her. The situation had stood for nearly 50 years. There was no reason to change it now. Thomas Jr. waited. A few days later, when William was away overseeing distant fields, the young man walked deliberately to the eastern wing. The corridor felt longer than it ever had, the air thicker, charged with decades of suppressed truth. He stopped before the final door, heart hammering against his ribs like divine accusation. He knocked softly. No answer. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by pale afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. It smelled of old books, beeswax, and faint lavender. Everything was neat, almost unnaturally preserved. The bed, still made with the same style of linens that had waited untouched for so many years, now bore the clear signs of long use. A small fire glowed in the hearth. Margaret sat by the window in a simple chair, gazing out at the garden she had watched for half a century. She was in her 60s now, hair pure white, face deeply lined with the quiet architecture of endurance and sorrow. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. When the door opened, she turned slowly, without surprise, as though she had been expecting this moment for years. Her eyes, dark, intelligent, carrying the weight of generations, met his. "You are William's son," she said softly. Her voice carried the same gentle timbre as the song he had heard in the corridor. "I am," Thomas Jr. replied, voice thick with emotion. For the first time in nearly 50 years, someone from the legitimate Harrington line had crossed the threshold not as jailer or servant, but as kin. And in that single meeting, the long silence that had guarded the family's sin began, at last, to break. The afternoon light in Margaret's room carried the soft gold of fading magnolia petals as Thomas Jr. sat across from the woman he had just learned was his half-aunt. The air felt thick with decades of unsaid words, scented with old paper, beeswax polish, and the faint lavender that Eleanor had grudgingly allowed. Outside the window, the gardens bloomed in indifferent beauty, rows of color that Margaret had watched change seasons through glass for nearly half a century. She spoke calmly, without the sharp edge of bitterness that might have been justified. Her voice carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had long ago made peace with a cage built not of iron but of reputation. She told him of her childhood in Virginia, raised by distant relatives who treated her as an inconvenient charity case after her mother's death. Of the letter that summoned her south. Of the carriage ride that delivered her into this room like a package too dangerous to open publicly. She described the early years, the terror of being unseen, the slow numbing into routine. The books that became her only true companions. The hymns she sang in minor keys when loneliness pressed too close. She spoke of watching her half-siblings grow, marry, and inherit the world while she remained a shadow cast by her father's youthful sin. Thomas Jr. listened, his hands clenched in his lap. When he finally asked the question burning in his chest, "Do you want to leave? Do you want freedom?" Margaret paused for a long time, gazing out at the live oaks draped in Spanish moss like mourning veils. "I am 63 years old," she said at last, her tone gentle yet resolute. "I have no family beyond these walls. No trade. No friends in the wider world. If I walked out tomorrow, I would be a woman of mixed blood with no protection, no means, and nowhere to turn. So no. I do not wish to leave this room. But I would like to be acknowledged. To sit at the table as family, not as a secret that must be fed in darkness. To be seen. Even once." Thomas Jr. promised change. He would speak to his father. He would argue for mercy, for recognition, for the basic dignity of blood. He left the room with righteous fire in his veins. William's response was ice. To acknowledge Margaret now would invite ridicule, scandal, and the collapse of everything the Harrington name represented. The world they inhabited demanded purity of lineage. Admitting her existence would stain it forever. The situation had stood for decades, it would stand longer. Thomas Jr. argued, pleaded, and raged in private, but the older man, shaped by the rigid codes of Lowcountry honor, would not bend. Then came 1861. Cannons thundered at Fort Sumter. The Civil War tore open the South like divine judgment long delayed. Young men from the plantation marched off in gray, carrying the family's convictions into battle. Resources were stripped for the Confederate cause. Enslaved people began slipping away at night, drawn toward Union lines and the promise of freedom. The fields suffered. The great house itself felt the strain of war. In 1863, William Harrington fell in a skirmish near Charleston. A bullet ended his life, and with it his iron grip on the family's secrets. Thomas Jr. inherited the plantation and the burdensome legacy of the Eastern Wing. The war changed everything. By 1865, the Confederacy lay in ruins. Slavery was abolished by constitutional amendment. The Harrington fortune, built on cotton and forced labor, crumbled. Fields went fallow. The grand social order that had made Margaret's confinement not only possible but logical in their eyes was shattered. Emancipation swept through the land like a cleansing wind, yet inside the great house, the old silence lingered. Margaret remained in her room. Now in her 70s, frail and white-haired, she had become a living relic of a world that no longer existed. The reasons for her isolation, once defended as necessary for reputation, felt archaic, almost grotesque, in the harsh light of Reconstruction. Yet Thomas Jr., now master of a diminished estate, chose continuity over courage. He told himself she was too old, too accustomed to her solitude. Exposure would only bring her pain. The deeper truth was uglier. The secret had become part of the family's identity. To reveal it would be to admit that their piety, their honor, their very claim to moral superiority had been built on a foundation of deliberate cruelty and denial. Margaret died quietly in 1872 at the age of 81. She had spent 51 years confined to that single room, more than half her life erased from the official story of the Harringtons. Her final days were marked by the same stoic grace she had shown throughout, reading scripture, writing final unsent reflections on forgiveness and justice, and gazing at the gardens one last time. The family faced their most delicate decision yet: what to do with her body. A public funeral would expose everything. Burial in the family plot would acknowledge her as kin. Secret disposal would reduce her to nothing. In a final act of calculated compromise, they chose obscurity. Margaret was laid to rest in a small, unmarked plot on the far edge of the plantation, far from the grand family cemetery with its carved stones and iron fences. A simple marker bore only her name and dates. No service. No mourners beyond a handful of trusted servants sworn to silence. No entry in the family Bible or official records. Even in death, she was hidden. After her passing, the Eastern Wing was sealed. The room where she had lived, read, sung, and endured was closed off. Furniture draped in sheets like funeral shrouds. Windows shuttered against the light. The bed, once prepared for a life that was never fully allowed, stood untouched again, now truly empty in the way the family had always pretended. The corridor became a place of deliberate forgetting, a tomb within the living house. Decades passed. The plantation struggled through Reconstruction, sharecropping, and the slow erosion of old fortunes. Thomas Jr. died, and the property passed to his son, Thomas Harrington III. The younger man had heard only vague whispers about the Eastern Wing, ghost stories told by aging servants, dismissed as superstition. In 1912, a fire broke out in the main house. Flames licked at the grand portico as workers and neighbors fought desperately to save the structure. In the chaos of assessing damage and clearing debris, they forced open the long-sealed door to the Eastern Wing. What they found chilled the blood. The room lay frozen in time. The bed still neatly made with linens that carried the faint scent of age but no human imprint from recent years. The wardrobe held garments never worn by any legitimate family member. The writing desk stood bare, as though waiting for a hand that would never return. But beneath a loose floorboard, a worker named James discovered something more powerful than any ghost: a hidden journal. Pages filled with Margaret's careful handwriting, detailed accounts of her arrival, her daily existence, her quiet observations of the family she could see but never join, her conversation with Thomas Jr., her gradual surrender to isolation, and her final reflections on sin, redemption, and the heavy cost of human pride. James brought the journal to Thomas III. The heir read it by lamplight, his face paling as the full weight of his family's hidden legacy unfolded. Here was not mere rumor, but a first-hand testament from the woman herself. Thomas III faced the same moral crossroads his father and grandfather had evaded. He could burn the journal and bury the truth forever. Or he could let it speak. In a rare act of courage, or perhaps exhaustion with inherited guilt, he chose revelation. He delivered the journal to a local historian studying Lowcountry life. The story of Margaret Harrington and the room that held her for 51 years finally broke into the light. The revelation sent ripples of shock through the community and beyond. Newspapers carried the tale. It seemed to distill the hypocrisies of the Old South, the fervent public defense of honor and Christian virtue alongside the private willingness to deny a human being's very existence for the sake of social standing. It raised uncomfortable questions that lingered like smoke. How many other invisible relatives had been hidden behind grand facades? What did it reveal about a society that prized reputation above basic humanity? How deep did the rot of selective blindness run? The eastern wing was eventually restored. The room became a somber memorial open to visitors who walked its floorboards, gazed at the preserved bed, and read excerpts from Margaret's journal. Some left in tears. Others in quiet anger. The space stood as a chilling reminder: a single room could contain an entire lifetime of erased dignity. Yet even preserved, the room retained its mystery. Intellectual understanding could catalog the facts, the fear of scandal, the rigid racial codes, the machinery of denial, but it could never fully capture the spiritual weight of what had happened there. The slow suffocation of a soul. The generational inheritance of guilt. The biblical echo of sins visited upon children and children's children. The Harrington Plantation still stands today, no longer a working estate but a site where history is confronted rather than concealed. Tourists walk the corridors. They see the columns that once gleamed like smiling teeth. They hear the wind move through the live oaks like restless spirits. And in the eastern wing, they pause before the bed that waited untouched for decades, a silent witness to humanity's capacity to look away from inconvenient truth. Margaret's story is no longer hidden. The silence has been broken. But the deeper questions remain, haunting anyone who listens. How many other rooms like this existed across the South, quiet chambers where living people were reduced to ghosts for the sake of family honor? What secrets do we still keep today, not behind locked doors but behind polite smiles and carefully maintained reputations? And most chilling of all, in our own lives, what truths are we willing to deny, what people are we willing to erase, to protect the image we present to the world? The bed in the eastern wing was never truly unused. It bore the weight of a woman's entire hidden existence. And in its stillness, it continues to speak, reminding us that some sins are not loud and dramatic, but quiet, ordinary, and therefore all the more terrifying. Because they could happen anywhere. Even in the most respectable homes. What do you think? Could a family really maintain such a secret for generations? Have we truly escaped the shadows of these hidden rooms, or do they simply wear different disguises today? If this tale of concealed sin, generational guilt, and the long reach of divine justice moved you, subscribe for more stories that pull back the veil on history's darkest corners. Hit the bell. Share it with someone who dares to look. Until next time, sleep well. But remember, some beds are empty for a reason.